Hi, folks. This is Wendell. If you want to find me online after we're done here, Facebook and Twitter is probably the best place to start to find me. And for the context of this webinar, I happen to have written all the Cisco Press cert guides related to these certs. That aside, mainly I want to talk about the exams, and so let's get into that. Brett had asked me to do a few level setting things up front. We'll just take a couple of 3 minutes on that. And then the rest of the time I'm going to talk about the technologies on the exams and some tips about how to approach studying for those so you'll be best prepared for it on exam day. So when Cisco announced changes to these exams back on March 26th, they kept the same exam structure, they just made new exams. So in this picture you still got a 2-exam path to CCNA at the top and a 1-exam path to CCNA at the bottom. Now, a couple of changes in there, but the structure stays the same. The name changed from plain old CCNA to CCNA routing and switching. The 2-exam path gets you a CCENT when you pass the ICND1 exam. The big news there, though, not depicted in the figure, is that Cisco also changed the minimum prereq for some popular other certs, namely CCNA Security, CCNA Wireless, and CCNA Voice, to CCENT. So you don't have to go all the way to CCNA routing and switching before you split off into those other technologies now. But otherwise, the structure stays the same. The other bit of background to keep in mind is that, as usual, Cisco is very generous with the transition options. You know, kudos to Cisco for doing that with every new exam that comes out. With the 2-exam path, you have a bit of an overlap. Cisco gives us through September 30th to take and pass the old exams, and the new exams have been out since March. So here's the deal. You can take any combination of old and new to get your CCNA routing and switching. You pick them. Both new, both old, one new, either combination. Some make more sense than others. If you've not started any study at all yet, go for the new. If you're almost done with your study with the old, go for the old. If you're kind of in between, that's kind of the tough place to pick. But all those options are available. So let's talk about the exams and what's on them. Anytime we've ever been in a class from since we were kids, teacher says, hey, there's a test Friday. What's the first question everybody wants to know, right? What's on the test? And the teacher answers, and the next question is, but what about blah, and what about blah, 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 etc. So we always want to know what's on the test, and whatever answer we get, we always want to know more. So let's start with the idea of what Cisco tells us is for sure, for real on the test. There's a formal definition of exam topics that Cisco gives us for every exam. There are 3 exams we'll talk about today. There's the new CCNA 200-120 exam, and then there are the exams in the 2-exam path, 100-101 and 200-101. If we were to look at the exam topics and look at every last word, it turns out that the CCNA exam is identical to, as far as exam topics go, to ICND1 plus ICND2. That is, whether you go for the 1-exam or 2-exam path, you've got to know the same stuff. Right. So when you're picking your exam path, you don't have to worry about one or the other having more topics in them. They are equivalent when we look at what Cisco has told us about them. Now, if you think about the 2-exam path a little bit, so if you look at ICND1 versus ICND2, as drawn, they look like the same size orange boxes there on the bottom. That's on purpose. If you counted the number of exam topics, there's actually a lot more in ICND1, but some of those are technically prerequisites for what's in the ICND2 exam. So it's roughly a 50-50 breakdown of what's in the ICND1 and ICND2 exam topics. For our purposes today, I'm going to go through exam topics, and I've already picked ahead of time some to drill down on and give you some tips about. And I'm going to take it first with ICND1, then with ICND2, knowing that all of it applies to CCNA. So if you're going for the 1-exam path, everything applies to you. All right, so that's where we're headed here. You can go ahead right now if you want to look while we're talking. Open up a web browser, go to learningnetwork.cisco.com, navigate as you see with the words there on the screen, go to the associate certs, look for the associate routing and switching, and then navigate till you find the exam topics link and you can see these. You'll see them during the presentation, but if you want to browse at your leisure, go for it. If you go look at the exam topics, remember here we're in class. We asked the teacher, what's on the test? Well, here's what Cisco's telling us formally, what's on the test. And this on the screen now is the literal first of 7 sections of exam topics that you'd see at Cisco's website. So operation of data, of IP data networks, and I've highlighted one of those. This one exam topic may be one of the most overlooked but most important exam topics Cisco ever puts in the scope of CCNA. And here's why. This is the one most closely tied to how well you do on a job interview. So let's expand that a little bit. Let's just say you go to a technical interview for a job, and it's the network engineer at the place you want to go work, and they draw this simple diagram on the left with 2 PCs and 3 routers and some links. And they say to you, predict where data flows between those 2 hosts across this network. In other words, they just paraphrase the exam topic. You could spend an hour technical interview doing nothing but answering that, and the technical interviewer saying, well, what if you had this feature turned on? What if you did NAT on router R2? What if you had an access list here? What if this line was actually a LAN switch and it did port security? Pretty much anything you ever see in the ICND1 exam could be filtered through how you can do and how you can perform this task. So one of the things you can keep in mind when you're preparing then is this. No matter what tool you're using to learn, if you're looking at a diagram, ask yourself, could I explain what I'm reading, what I'm watching in a video, what I've been doing in a lab? Could I explain that to my friend, my spouse, my mom, my kid, with this simple diagram? Could, pretend they're the interviewer. Maybe they don't know networking, but could I explain the basics to them? Can I articulate what's really going to happen? Why is PC1 going to router R1, for instance? Why does R1 choose to forward the packet to router R2? What do the headers look like in front of those IP packets? So that's the kind of thing Cisco's looking for in that kind of an exam topic. But the beauty of that one from a testing perspective is they can ask you something incredibly simple or the most complicated question in your exam, all based on what's happening in between there. So suggestion for prep, try to explain what happens in small networks like that to anybody that will listen while you're prepping. It's a good way to let yourself know whether you've got it down or not. So that's an example of one. So let's take a look. Second section, if we're again looking through the 7 sections of the ICND1 exam topics, the second part's on LAN switching. LAN switching is very fundamental. VLANs, there's a lot more of that in ICND1, and part of that is VLAN trunking with the item that you see highlighted at the bottom. Now, in the case of VLAN trunking, say you've, just a quick definition for those of you that haven't learned about it yet. If you've got 2 switches like those you see in the diagram, that multicolored vertical line in the middle is physically a cable, but it has different colors to represent the different VLANs whose traffic goes across the cable. In this case, we show VLANs 17 and 19, and frames in those 2 different VLANs cross the cable, and they have an extra header that says this frame's in 17 or this frame's in 19. In 30 seconds or less, I just described VLAN trunking, and to be honest, to configure trunking right, I could give you another 30 seconds and you could have it down. So this exam topic, to do it right in your shop, is easy. So what's the problem for the exam? What's the challenge? Well, it turns out there are several configuration options that let these switches dynamically decide if they trunk or not. There are options that turn off that dynamic ability. There are show commands that show information about trunking as well as other features all in the same output that can be a little tough to understand. So the challenge can be this. You can use trunking at your job every day, and it works for 2 years straight, and you don't have to think hard about it. And then you're thinking about 5 different commands you never use to be ready for it for the actual exam. So for this particular topic, the tip would be whatever you're using to practice your hands-on, go through all the config options for VLAN trunking between the switches and make sure you've got the combinations down of what works and what doesn't. So moving along here, A totally different topic now, IP addressing, both version 4 and version 6. Lots more version 6 in the new exams. And I've highlighted one exam topic and even highlighted a subpart of that that says using VLSM and summarization. First off, one of the biggest requirements to do well in these exams is mastering IP addressing. If you've done any reading about these exams, you will have already known that you've got to know your IP addressing. It is simply a requirement. Here's an IP version 4 address, here's a mask, and what subnet does it reside? That needs to be a somewhat automatic mental process. However, with the changes to these exams, VLSM moves to ICND1, and that simply makes it more complicated. So, brief definition, say I've got a network topology as you see here. If you look around at the IP version 4 addresses, you'll notice that they're all in the same class B network 172.16. So it's one classful network in use. But if you look at the red subnet masks, there are 3 different masks in use. And that's by definition variable length subnet masking, the use of more than one mask in a single classful network. Why is that such a big deal? Well, it's not a huge deal, to be honest. But what it means is this: if you master IP version 4 subnetting, you're fine. If you're a little shaky on IP version 4 subnetting, VLSM questions are going to cost you a little more time on the exam, because now you've got to do multiple sets of math to analyze the numbers in that topology. So you just need to be ready to ratchet up just a little more for ICND1, whereas before March 26 with the old exams, you could wait till the ICND2 side of the equation to worry about that. So it does raise the bar a tad. Here's the middle part, the 4th of 7 in ICND1, and the one I chose to focus on here, it's another trunking topic. It says configure and verify inter-VLAN routing, router on a stick. One of the more fun things to talk about. Router on a stick is kind of a fun name for it. But basically we're talking about an idea like the top physically, but logically like the bottom part of the figure. The top, the black lines are the physical cables. So router B1 has one cable connecting it to switch 1. But there are 2 VLANs, each VLAN associated with a subnet. So the router needs to route packets between those subnets, between those VLANs, but it has only one physical cable. And that breaks some early rules of what you learned about how IP routers work. Logically speaking, what happens is that router B1 on the bottom needs to have some kind of an interface into each of those VLANs. So we have to somehow configure it so it knows about both VLANs. And to do that, we basically configure VLAN trunking on router B1. Now, this topic tends to give people heartache for a couple of reasons. So here's some things to watch for. One is switches can dynamically learn about trunking. Routers can't. So you have to statically configure trunking on both the router and the switch. So that's something to watch for. The other thing is that the routers, of course, are layer 3 aware in this case. The switches are focused on layer 2, just doing layer 2 things. So we've got a lot of layer 3 concepts to go with the layer 2 concepts on the router. It's attainable. Lots of people do it. Just have to work through it. But it's another topic that does trunking, and it's easy to then confuse that with your other trunking between switches. So just keep that in mind as you go. If you're sitting there thinking, you know, Wendell's not quite done with ICND1 topics yet, and it already seems like it's a lot, well, it is. ICND1's a lot to bite off these days. So on this next 5th of 7 sections of exam topics, this is a good one to just pause and talk about study plan. I'm not going to talk too much about NAT as a technology on this one, although I've highlighted it on the screen. When you get through whatever you're using to study, whatever tools, you get through the basics of LAN switching, the basics of IPv4 routing. There's other topics like NAT, like access control lists that you see here, like NTP, like DHCP, that you don't have to know to get the basics of switching and routing down. It's probably worth your time to take a breath, review the earlier material you've studied, make sure you've got it down, be strong on those earlier topics, and then start folding in and adding additional topics. like access control lists sometimes throw people off because of the logic and what it matches. NAT, there's a lot of concept behind NAT. There's a lot of config behind NAT. It can be a big topic to itself. So I just suggest, particularly when you get into the topics you see here on this page, good time to take a breath and think a little more. Do that review first. Moving on to the sixth section, configure and verify port security features such as, well, I don't have enough space on the page to list all the such as. In the real exam topics online, you see a lot of detail under that, just not listed on the page. So what do we mean by port security? When you buy a Cisco router and you take it out of the cardboard box, you plug in the cables, turn on the power, it's ready to forward frames. It wants to forward frames. However, the world is a dangerous place. People want to attack us, so we have to do things to secure the network. And port security, within the scope of CCNA routing and switching, is the one feature in that scope that does the most to protect the LAN switch environment. It looks at incoming frames, the source MAC address in those frames, and lets the switch then decide, do I let the port keep functioning or not? Or do I just throw away the offending or out of the traffic that's breaking the rules by using the wrong MAC address? So for instance, in this case, on those top 3 ports for the switch on the left, with one device hooked up with known MAC addresses, maybe port security just says, hey, frames coming from each of those 3 MAC addresses respectively, that's good, we allow it. That 4th port, there's a switch, it's got 20 devices out there. We'll allow up to 20 devices to send in traffic, but no more. And react, maybe shut down the port if something more happens, just to prevent different kinds of attacks. So that's the big idea with port security. The challenge you have for the exam is a couple of things. One is port security has a lot of config options that have defaults. So you go to the exam and you have a question and maybe they took all defaults. So you have to remember what the default settings are. At the same time, there's 3 different levels of actions that are taken when an incoming frame breaks the rules. You've got to dig that out of show commands. So while it's not too hard to configure if you see a problem that says configure for a maximum of 3 addresses and pre-configure one of those addresses as blah, that's pretty easy. And working through when you don't have all the configuration up front is a little more challenging. So it's just one of those things you have to pay a little closer attention to when you're learning that part of it. Almost done with perspective on ICND1. Troubleshoot, 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 troubleshoot. Lots of troubleshooting, even on ICND1, lots more in ICND2. So in general, let's talk about that word troubleshoot. Cisco, particularly this message is more for those of you that don't know much about Cisco exams, period. Like this probably would be your first exam you would take that's from Cisco. Cisco exams are far more than learn fact, answer question about fact. They really want you to show relevant skills to doing the real job. And that's never more apparent than this kind of an exam topic. When they say troubleshoot and resolve trunking problems on Cisco switches, it is very much that. Maybe you don't even see the configuration in this particular question. You get the output of one show command, and you've got to interpret that output to figure out what is the possible configuration problem, or is it something totally unrelated to trunking that's causing trunking to fail? Very much like what happened in a real network if something was broken. So there is quite a bit higher level of required skill, if you will. So that gives you a little bit of insight into a few of those. Obviously, we can't, in the time we have, go through every last exam topic to get through those, but that's a flavor for where you are in ICND1.